I am here as representative of a coalition that started in Madison and is now a county-wide initiative. We are a group of people that live here who are concerned about improper siting. We are not anti-renewable energy by any stretch. We want to make sure that property values and health, welfare, and safety of residents does not suffer the consequences of mixing incompatible land use. Unfortunately, wind is either sometimes summed up as anti-wind or pro-wind. We are trying to take a happy medium approach, a mainstream approach that says, actually, neither stance is entirely true. We are pro-health, pro-safety. Because when a turbine is placed, it reclassifies the portion of land that it takes up, as well as the access roads and the nuts and bolts that have to come into play to make that happen. Per the Farm Service Agency and the USDA, that is how they reclassify that land. And while the amount of acreage may not be significant to the farmer, because it reclassifies the land, that is why we are taking the position that it is in fact an incompatible land use. The turbines that are being put in and being proposed, turbines that were just rejected in Shiawassee County and north of Kokomo, Indiana, 2 different projects, not DTE projects, were 600 feet tall. So these supersized turbines, if you will, that's not really a term, I just kind of went with it. I used it because turbine height in the last 20 years has more than doubled. So what we thought was a turbine and maybe still have in our mind as something we saw once and went, oh, that's kind of cool how you can harness the wind. That's very different than what is being proposed here. We really are in a Model T. It's not a perfect analogy, but we're at the beginning of this part of the renewable energy industry, if you will, because there are not any studies, because they haven't been used long-term to support the claims of whether or not there's minimal consequences with their use. The magnitude of their size definitely causes unforeseen consequences, and we will talk about that this evening. So Sherwood Township needs to decide whether or not it is appropriate to put 500 to 600 feet tall turbines measured, and it's unfortunate that we don't have a lot of specifics about how DTE is proposing this project. Their material, the only thing written that says a distance says at the typical 300 meter minimum distance. They want to measure that from a house's foundation instead of the property line. So this township has to determine whether that's in the best interest of the majority of the people who live in this township. The wind industry does not share data. I'll give you some examples of that in a little bit. And they have not been real forthcoming with some of those second and third order effects that no one saw coming. Sorry, I'm not a pro, I go this way. So since industrial wind came to Michigan, every time it has been put on the ballot, every single township has rejected it. Several states, Maine, North Carolina, Tennessee, all had issued moratoriums on wind to try to get ahead of this issue because it is very complex. At the end of the day, while there's many different thoughts on renewable energy, again, what we're going to try to talk about tonight is the incompatible land use issue. So our first concern is, what does that mean to the nature of our communities, whether they be rural, agricultural, or lakeside? Here's an example of Union Lake today, and there is just a little clip of what it would look like after DTE came in. And I don't remember whose pontoon this is, but I know it's someone's. I'm sorry. So here's another example of what we could be dealing with. So as I said earlier, it's very hard to find specifics of what DTE is proposing. And so when I first learned about this, my uncle was approached to be a leaseholder, and he gave me the information that they had left with him. And so I'm using this information this evening to talk about what DTE says is myth and fact. And we have added a third category, and we very kindly call it reality. Because DTE has put in a lot of information in their materials that I would really rather not address because it isn't about land use, I'm still going to do that because to me it's very indicative of what the salesperson is willing to say about why this is an important thing to do. So I know that I'm going to give you a lot of information this evening. I'm going to go as fast as I can without rambling and would just ask for some leeway. I'll try to do it as quickly as I can. And we will take, I believe we have questions at the end, so if you have questions at the end, you can ask them. When I sat down to do this, I went to mainstream resources. I went to universities, I went to public health assessment reports. Many states, Michigan does not have one yet, many states have done a public health assessment that then their counties can use as a tool to try to figure out how to site turbines. Oregon had a very, very comprehensive one, and I'll reference that frequently this evening. I also really like, because it talks about Michigan, not because it's where I went to school, a researcher from the University of Michigan did a very comprehensive study of what has happened in the thumb as told to her through landowners in the thumb. I believe it was 10 or 14 townships that she reached out to. And I think she had a very fair and accurate, she said, here's the good things, and then she said, here's the not so good things. And the objection, DTE has said, oh, well, that's what they told her, so she had to write that down. Well, that's kind of the point. And the researcher says that in one of the newspaper articles that I have a reference to somewhere, that before her study there was either pro-wind or anti-wind telling you this, and now we have her study to kind of say, wait, there's different sides to this. So the first thing that DTE says, and I think this is very, very relevant because a lot of folks are under the impression that this is going to be good for the community. The reality is, so DTE says that local communities see significant substantial benefits in the form of local tax revenue, provides funding for police, schools, roads, other vital services. 3 counties, which are the most heavy in turbines, have had this really significant increase to their tax bases, etc. But a key part there is that although those revenues have been a boon to their tax base, because of recent changes to the property taxation rules, that has significantly reduced the amount of tax revenue that the local townships are able to collect from wind developers. They also failed to mention that they were the ones that lobbied the Michigan Tax Commission to change those depreciation schedules. So they tried to accelerate them, so it actually ended up receiving a lot less revenue than was projected or forecasted for their townships when they approved the projects. A Huron County official said it this way: the fact that these developers went to the tax tribunal to fight these taxes indicated they reneged on their promises, and those are the promises that they made to the people of this county. The county commissioner said they placed various ads in the newspapers which touted them as being good community members, yet there's appeal after appeal after appeal. So DTE, so back in 2013 is when DTE put their appeals out to the tax tribunal. It is still openly appealed right now today, 5 years later. The University of Michigan report, Sarah Mills' study, confirms in fact that local official worries that the state might make further changes to the taxation, thus they've been reluctant to lower taxes. While wind developers have paid millions of additional dollars in tax revenue to rural communities, there has been no discernible improvement in the household budgets of the taxpayers throughout these wind farms. Economic impacts are really felt by the people with turbines on their property, but not so much by anyone else. One of the biggest things that this researcher found was that if you put a turbine on your land, you feel 20% more likely than a farmer who does not lease their land that you had a good succession plan in place for the next generation of your farm. They also found that the people who leased their land were significantly more likely to build a new construction home on land they already owned. The Oregon Health Assessment confirms this also. Landowners who lease their land may accrue substantial economic benefits. However, landowners who do not lease their land will not directly experience these benefits and may experience negative impacts if their property values decrease, if they're adversely affected by unwanted noise, visual, air pollution, and other impacts. So that is the exact point of all of this, is that the benefit to the leaseholder should not come at the expense of the non-participant. DTE sheet says that this will help our schools, our local schools. That actually is not accurate. The University of Michigan School of Public Policy last summer issued a paper that says School districts feel little to no effect of wind farms. The entrance of wind development has not affected the budgets of these school districts, and in this specific case, wind developers should be careful in promoting the benefit to local schools and not overstate the impact of their taxes. For any of you who are educators, do we have any educators in here? It's because Michigan does redistributive funding. Once the local school district raises that dollar amount, anything in excess of that goes to the state or to the intermediate level. So the money does go somewhere, but it doesn't stay in the local community. In Indiana, I wish there was more time in the day to research all of this in Michigan, so I went to Indiana instead. Every single school system in the state of Indiana that has a wind project has had a significant decrease in their student population. So fewer students mean less money, because that's how you get your funding, is based on your enrollment. DTE also says on their myth and fact sheet that it benefits the roads. You're going to see improvements in the roads. Columbia Township in the thumb, it's not a DTE project, but it is a industrial wind project. They just went online in January of this year, and just at the ballot that we all hopefully voted in August, they asked for more money for their roads and their emergency services. So you have a township that has industrial wind since January of this year who needs extra money for their roads and their emergency services. DTE also at some point in my township, I don't know if this is the case here, had leaseholders send a letter to our township officials, and the very first thing that they said was wind energy development creates stable, high-paying jobs. The Michigan LARA, Licensing and Regulatory Affairs, and the Department of Energy office put out a big report that was called Readying Michigan to Make Good Energy Decisions. In it, they say that, and they specifically reference DTE and Consumers since they are the two largest utility companies in the state, that the large majority of jobs that were created via these renewable energy investments were temporary construction jobs. Now, temporary construction job is better than no job at all. I don't want to take away from the fact that a job is a job, but for it to be portrayed as a stable, high-paying, when in fact our own state report says no, that's not accurate. In the thumb, where townships where the developers said there's going to be a lot of high revenue and a number of new jobs, citizens were less satisfied because the developers overpromised and underdelivered. The landowners in those communities were disappointed by how few local jobs had been created, and the local officials noted that that was not in the technical or construction field, but was actually in the hospitality field. This particular Huron County official says, now, however, having seen what jobs they create and just the general look and so forth that they're changing the county, that this person thinks that the majority would no longer support additional wind development. And in fact, last year when wind was put out to Huron County, again, every single township in the thumb said no more. One of the main arguments for wind energy is that it brings jobs to the communities. It does bring jobs, but not permanent local jobs. This gentleman was frustrated when he saw a parade of trucks that could have been given out to local contractor jobs, but the technician stayed on the site and then went on to the next site. One more on jobs, and this is really the part that I'm going to hone in on for time. People tend to think that they create jobs, and the researcher said this may explain why the survey shows that in the communities without wind farms, those are the people that thought they created jobs. If you talk to people in the communities that had wind farms, they said no, if wind development has already taken place, we know that we didn't see any kind of local job creation. From an economic development standpoint, it had zero impact. That is from a Huron County official. So I just went through all of that. Really, if these were to come to Sherwood, they would certainly benefit those that receive lease payments. No doubt about it, don't want to take away from that at all. But the impacts are not so much felt by anyone else. That is the direct quote from the University of Michigan researcher. Wind developers should not promote the benefits to school or be careful in how they do that, as the local schools see little to no benefit, and the large majority of jobs were created that were created were temporary. So that to me doesn't really support the idea that this is good for the community. DTE's biggest thing that they also say is that wind parks don't lower property values. And in their fact, they say, we find no negative impact. in Huron County, the personal property class doubled from the time that they track it here in this fact. Okay, but personal property class is not the same thing as real property value like land or a home. So DTE is supporting their claim that there's no negative impact on property values, and then they're talking about personal property class. Michigan State Tax Commission says personal property class is the value of the turbine. It is the value assessed to that turbine, why those numbers doubled. And for me, this was a really concerning fact because I felt like they were trying to distract me with some really big numbers so that I didn't look at what they were really saying. Because I'm pretty sure that somebody at this particular wind developer company knows that industrial personal property class is not the same thing as a residential property value. If you look one step further at DTE's fact, they reference that property values don't have negative impact, a Berkeley study. There's been 2 big significant Berkeley studies. In both of them, I believe, actually in the first one, I need to double check on the second one. I'm kind of a walking encyclopedia of information I never really wanted to learn about, so I will double check that one. They said that they looked at houses that were 10 miles, up to 10 miles away from a turbine. Okay, well, a turbine and a house 10 miles, I would not suggest that that is going to have a big value either, but that's how far out they went when they looked and they studied real estate sales. The Berkeley study said that aesthetics and property value are intrinsically linked. And they also said, it is reasonable to assume that if a home's scenic vista overlaps with a disamenity, that home might be devalued, as has been found for high voltage transmission lines. So it is common knowledge among real estate appraisers that an ITC line or a high voltage line devalues a piece of property. It just does. When you really start to dig into the Berkeley study, and I would be happy to show any of you who are interested all of my source material and all of my reference points for this. The Berkeley study looked at sales of homes. They got actual sales data, and then if there was something that was too far away from the statistical mean, they discarded that data, even though it was actual real estate transaction data that they were examining. So if something was too low, they threw it out. But then they also excluded data where the homes were sold to wind developers. They considered those transactions not valid and not included. One, however, might reasonably expect that the property value of those homes were impacted by the presence of the turbine. For most of us, if we are blessed enough to be homeowners, we work very hard to pay our mortgage. So this is really one point that should resonate with all of us. If you look at what real estate appraisers say, not wind developers or people that are in support of a renewable energy industry, but if you go to real estate appraisers, you will see time and time again. I have yet to see a study by a real estate appraiser that has showed, nope, no effect. Homes within 2 miles of a turbine sold for an average of 38% less than homes further away. Some homes within the turbine's 2-mile footprint sold for 58% less. Turbines between 1 and 3 miles away negatively impact property values between 15 and 30%, while having one turbine on the parcel reduces prices by 60%. The state of Minnesota, their Public Utilities Commission, just in May, in May, issued a very significant ruling. They required a wind developer to purchase 2 homes. The people who lived there found themselves with a turbine sited too close, had numerous issues and problems because of improper siting, and after years of litigation, the Public Utilities Commission stepped in and said, you either purchase those homes or we're shutting you down. They purchased the homes. But the tough part for those people was that's the best they could hope for. They had to leave their home. In both family situations, they had been in their homes for generations. The University of Michigan study also concluded, while there are differential impacts on residential and agricultural parcels, there are a reduction in home values but no impact on agricultural land values. A turbine, if you look at data and sales data, a turbine is not going to hurt the price of the farmland. It's not going to. But it is going to cause a reduction in home values per Sarah Mills' U of M study. A gentleman in Shiawassee County who happens to be a commissioner and a real estate agent said, It's common sense. I'm 100% sure that no one ever came in and said to me, tell me, please show me a nice ranch near a wind turbine. We don't track non-sales, we track sales. So one of the issues that comes about with land use specific to property values is that wind developers generally like to cite turbines based on the foundation of your home versus your property line. This causes a big problem for homeowners. I'm not a techie person. This is not my diagram. It was the nicest one I could find online. So I'm going to route you over here to my more Pam budgeted piece of core board from the dollar store. If DTE were allowed to place a turbine based on the foundation of my home, what it does, I'm a little tiny landowner, okay? I own less than 3 acres. If they're allowed to do that, based on what's called a no-build zone in the DTE contract of 1,500 feet, where you have to get permission to build within 1,500 feet of the base of a turbine, if they are allowed to place within 1,000 feet of my dwelling versus my property line, that creates for me this little parcel here that now is no longer considered safe to build. I have looked and looked online. I believe my Madison Township officials have requested it and have still not received it. We have asked for a copy of the manufacturer's safety information about what is an appropriate evacuation zone on a turbine. It's very hard to find something that's current for a GE turbine in particular. But what this does then, so this is my leased neighbor, and I've got turbines here. Now I have an area for my neighbor and myself that is not considered safe to build on. That is, at best, it's an uncompensated easement. And as wind does not have eminent domain, then that becomes trespass zoning. That means that that portion of my land, if you're allowed to measure from the foundation of my home, if you're allowed to measure from property lines, and it's within, outside of that range, that's a moot point. Because DTE doesn't have specifics other than saying 300 meters typical minimum distance, it's very hard to know what the intent would be. Would they want to cite them so that they take a piece of my land that is no longer usable for my current enjoyment and pleasure? So, Wisconsin is another state that did a very comprehensive study, and they said, casting too wide of a net creates a risk of missing the real effect industrial wind has on property values. So, the Berkeley study, which went 10 miles out from a turbine, that's too big of a, you're looking at too big of a slice of the pie, basically. Personal property class, not the same thing as property values for land, and that numerous studies, time and time again, show it does cause a devaluation if it is allowed to be improperly cited. The next big thing, and why we see, I believe, why we see a lot of devaluation of land is because we have such an increase in noise level. DTE says, nope, it's a myth that wind turbines generate too much noise. The fact of the matter, they say, is they give examples of it at the typical 300-meter minimum distance. They give examples of what the decibel level sounds like: singing birds, babbling brook, rainfall. Closer to home, what your refrigerator runs, etc. And they have 2 reference pieces here. And if you look at the first one, it says acoustic group says wind turbine infrasound less than a heartbeat. If you track that study down, it was done in Australia. The study looked at homes, I believe there were 8 total. They studied 2 homes that were near turbines. One was almost a mile away and one was 0.87 miles away, and they were both brick construction. Brick and stick built handle sound very differently. So they looked at that and they said 2 homes that they studied then equated to no health issues, infrasound generated less than a person's heartbeat. Nowhere in this study was there any comparison to what a heartbeat is or anything like that. The second study, the power of suggestion generates wind farm symptoms, they actually went and talked to about 50 college kids, and they had them listen to 10 minutes of stereo noise and 10 minutes of nothing. And they suggested, oh, what do you hear? What's the problem? And the kids said, oh, I think there's something, whatever. And they extrapolated that all the way to mean that the power of suggestion generates wind farm symptoms. People who live with improperly sited turbines describe it as a very different experience. You have the noise of the whooshing of the blades, which is actually kind of minimal. When that nacelle, that big chunk at the top, when that turns, people say that sounds like a diesel engine. I've had wonderful people that said, Pam, we went and drove and listened to one and it wasn't too bad. We didn't think it was too loud. And my question is, what was it generating at? What was the capacity of the wind? What was the wind blowing that day? How many were there? Was there one or was there three or was there four? Because all of those things come into play when it comes to noise. Again, DTE says that the typical 300 meters is 43 decibels. I don't know about you, but unless I'm buying an appliance, I don't really think about decibels, okay? I don't know. I was an English major. I'm not a techie person. Rural average nighttime noise in Michigan is 28 decibels, okay? DTE says that they need at least, I believe the zoning that they asked for, and I'm not sure what it was for here in your township. If anybody knows what was proposed, please shout it out. I believe they want up to 55 decibels. Here's where the math comes in. A 10% increase in decibel level is nearly twice as loud. So if I'm currently 28 nighttime, that's an average. We obviously haven't done any noise studies or anything like that, okay? But if that's what I am and they're allowed to go up to 45 or 55, then that's 2 to 3 times my ambient noise level. So it may not sound like it's a big deal, but if you enjoy the background noise that you have at home now, you can know that DTE wants to more than double that. Research to describe industrial wind noise as more annoying than the hum or roar of transportation because its repetitive nature and variability, swish thump, pulsating, even uneven quality enables the noise to repeatedly capture the attention, become more difficult to ignore. Unlike vehicle traffic, which gets quieter at night, the turbines sound louder at night because it's quiet. So wind shear sets in, and this detail has important implications for sleep disruption. The World Health Organization says that a safe nighttime noise guideline is 30 to 40 decibels. They say that anything above 55 on an extended basis becomes dangerous for public health. The Oregon assessment that I thought was very comprehensive also says environmental noise in community settings is linked to sleep disturbance, annoyance, stress, and decreased cognitive performance. These effects, undesirable in their own right, can in turn adversely affect physical health. So DTE comparing these noises to birds and babbling brooks, there's a little bit more to it than that. If a turbine is allowed to be improperly sited too close to home, residents say the noise is more like a bumblebee in their ear or a diesel engine when that spins. DTE says studies have found that neither noise nor light from wind turbines has any direct effect on physical or mental health. The state of Oregon disagrees. They say environmental noise is linked to, and this is specific to turbines, okay? This is not just in general for them. Environmental noise is linked to sleep disturbance, annoyance, stress, and decreased cognitive performance, which in turn can then adversely affect physical health. A small number of studies have linked the noise to increased annoyance, feelings of stress and irritation, sleep disturbance, and decrease of quality of life. For anybody who's been in the hospital for a few nights in a row and your sleep is disrupted or whatever it might be, you're not your normal sleep patterns, after a week or so, that takes a toll. After a month or so, it's horrible. Can you imagine month after month after month? A limited but growing body of evidence has linked environmental noise to small increased risks for hypertension and cardiovascular disease. This is where they talk again about what a standard healthy level is. And this goes back to what I said about that we really are at the beginning of this industry with these turbines being this size. It's not been studied. DTE's turbines, I believe the first turbine went in 2008 in the thumb. So we're 10 years in, and as far as I know, no one has studied this. People with greater exposure to noise, such as those that live nearby, are more likely to experience negative health effects than those with lower levels of exposure. The EPA and the World Health Organization both suggest that long-term increases of 5 decibels or greater may result in community noise impact. One of the things that the University of Michigan researcher wanted people to know was the red blinking lights at night. She says your community should know about that. That was a big concern that people shared with her when she surveyed them. The state of Michigan referenced a study which said being that having a large-scale utility wind generation system is not without adverse health impacts on nearby residents, and recommends that on the basis of their data, that setbacks distances need to be greater than 2 kilometers in hilly terrain. Noise travels differently, flat versus hills. Then there is a gentleman, retired MSU professor and a Central Michigan University professor. I referenced them here. It's Punch and James, I believe. Yes. Did a very, very thorough 4-decade study of noise from turbines on health. 4 decades of data. And they say, the reviewed evidence overwhelmingly supports the notion that acoustic emissions from industrial turbines is a leading cause of adverse health effects in a substantial segment of the population. To prevent adverse health effects, scientists have recommended distances between turbines and residents be 0.5 to 2.5 miles, and 1.25 miles or more has been commonly recommended, and that the only practical means of achieving acceptable sound levels is through distance. Story after story, when you start to look and filter, and I know there is a lot of information out there on the internet, but story after story comes from people who thought, okay, this is going to be fine, this is fine, no worries, and then find themselves with consequences that they did not anticipate. There were a husband and wife just north of Ludington, could no longer sleep at night. They moved down into the basement. The woman went to the dentist, and he says, what are you doing? And she said, what do you mean? All 4 of her back molars were loose because she had been grinding her teeth at night just since the turbines went in. She and her husband, along with, I believe it was 16 other homeowners, I'd have to double check, I believe it was 16 or 17 homeowners within that wind farm project sued consumers, and they won. But they had to leave their home, where they raised their children, and took a 30% hit on its value. The settlement numbers are not disclosed, so I'm assuming they made that up, but I don't really know. So the reality is that there is clearly enough evidence to indicate that sound and low-frequency noise can cause annoyance, sleep disturbances, stress, and a variety of other adverse health effects to warrant siting the turbines at a minimum distance of 1.25 miles away, 1.25 away from property lines to sufficiently avoid such harmful effects. Turbines, DTE says that it is a myth that they're prone to break-in and danger surrounding homes. The fact is, while there is some malfunction and breakage, as there was anything, a properly installed turbine has a low incident of breaking down. When I first did this presentation, and I have not had a chance to go back and update it since May, so if you will forgive me, it's not quite current on this fact. I went back and actually looked back to March of 2017, from the time that DTE signed its first lease in my township to the time that I gave the presentation in May. Wow. And I was able to find 41 reports of structural failure, fire, rotor, throw, fragment, etc. So I don't know what that means statistically. I would never pretend that I knew what that meant. But to say that it's seldom is probably not the whole story. Now, has anyone, a resident or person working under a turbine, ever been hit and killed by a piece of blade? No. I'm not going to pretend. If you're out in your field, watch out. But we don't know. Because unless you base your setbacks on what science says for blade throw, then you are assuming a more than normal risk if you're underneath one. There's a gentleman by the name of Andrew Kuziak. He has researched wind development for several decades. He is a expert, international and domestic, and he wrote an editorial piece, and I believe it was, so 2 years ago, he did an editorial piece in Nature magazine, and he says, vast quantities of information are collected by manufacturers, operators, and utility companies, yet hidden in their archives. The information is prohibitively difficult for anyone outside to access. The state of California, because they were one of the first folks to go with renewable energy, they said back in 2006, we need a kind of a better, I'm paraphrasing, they didn't really call it a better business bureau, we need a way to track this information, because right now we have no way to track this information. We have no idea whether things are being reported or not. So it has been identified now for over a decade, and there still is no way to report and track data on that. So the reality is that the reporting of blade failure is very limited due to the sensitivity of the industry. A setback of 3.5 times the height of the turbine is recommended to lower the risk of endangering surrounding homes. That is to have a reasonable amount of risk. This particular research came out in February of 2018. They had changed it. It was prior to that, it was 3 times the overall turbine height is recommended to lower the risk, and they changed it to 3.5. They have since retracted that after it kind of got out there into the social media world, if you will. But at the very best, it was 3 times the overall height recommended to lower the risk of endangering the surrounding homes. And I have some information there about how far things can be projected and thrown. A lot of science, 2,200 feet if it's under normal operating conditions, and 6,500 feet if it is operating at out of control runaway speeds. So the next myth and fact that we were provided with on the wind sheet says that turbines do have lights. Energy companies conduct extensive testing to determine how to minimize that impact of lights and shadow flicker on surrounding homes and communities. The Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy says you have to be, and this was based on a 400-foot turbine, I believe, that you have to be 0.87 miles away to get rid of shadow flicker. Okay? I don't have the techie ability to put a little video in here. If you have not ever seen a video of shadow flicker, please go to YouTube and Google a few and just look and see what we're talking about. Shadow flicker is not an everyday occurrence. There was a very nice lady who stood and said, I can't live with shadow flicker every day. You're not going to get shadow flicker every day. You're going to get it in season when the turbine or turbines are between you and the sun. So it would be seasonal depending on your home and where you're based. There are modeling computer programs that can help a company like DTE try to minimize that. But whether or not that is effective, that is only depends on what is allowed via zoning. So in fact, responsible zoning protects the health and welfare of residents to prevent shadow flicker from encroaching on a non-participant homeowner or public roads. There have been no recorded instances, as far as I know, of accidents with shadow flicker, but a lot of people have said shadow flicker or red blinking lights at night causes a problem while they're driving. DTE says that they take great care to minimize the impact on wildlife. They talk about that they follow guidelines per the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera, et cetera. They say bird deaths are minimal, and they compare them to deaths from cars, airplanes, towers, et cetera. The reason that this particular fact really resonated with me is because earlier in the presentation I had mentioned that bats or I've mentioned unforeseen consequences of turbines. The bat population is a wonderful example, sadly, of what has happened to bats since these big turbines came in. So bats save farmers $22.9 billion annually. And when the big turbines get going, it creates enough pressure change that when they were going out to study bird kills underneath the turbines, they started finding all of these bats that were perfectly intact. They took them back, they researched, their lungs implode because the pressure change under the turbines and within a certain range of the turbines is so great that they die. The Indiana office of the Fish and Wildlife, as well as a top researcher, a bat biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. So these are people that are incredible organizations with much expertise, say, if current industry practices continue and wind turbine installation grows, bat populations already weakened by a disease, a white nose fungus, will crash. Their populations rely on very high adult survival rates, and that means that they recover very slowly. So this is an example of we put something out there and we had no idea that it was going to cause a problem, and such a significant problem for part of the system. Per Fish and Wildlife, industrial wind developments can cause behavioral problems and physiological effects, as well as damage hearing from acoustic overexposure. They say that bird mortality should not be dismissed offhand because here again, like the researcher who studied turbine throw and blade throw, here again, despite numerous calls for more transparency, and availability of reports to the public and scientists, bird mortality collision data largely remains confidential. So now we've got two examples, just from this little bit, of where the industry does not share information with the public. And the bat population is bordering on a crisis, as global increases in mortalities was an unforeseen byproduct of industrial turbines. DTE says that researchers think that wind power might be beneficial to crops because they circulate the air, reduces the dew, which can cause fungus, etc. They say when a wind tower needs to be removed, the funds are there and DTE will remove the turbines and restore the land. In that very same National Geographic article, when you pull it up, 2 paragraphs down, it says, the turbine's influence on temperatures could also have a downside for crops. Effects on crops will be complex, and one good thing can offset another bad thing. DTE also says that they will remove the turbines and restore the land. I had heard the numbers 40 to 42 loads of concrete in cement trucks to put in to make the base of the turbine, okay? In this binder that was left, or folder that was left, DTE also has up to 2 million pounds, up to 50 cement trucks of concrete is put in for each base. DTE says they will remove the turbines and restore the land. But when you look at the lease, DTE is only required to remove facilities to 4 feet below grade. That is a lot of concrete left in the ground. At the very least, if we're going to do this, then you should take all of that concrete out. But what bothers me personally is when it is misrepresented as, we will restore the land. That's not true. The University of Michigan researcher said that though farmland preservation is rarely considered when officials establish setbacks for turbines, the amount of land rendered undevelopable by the presence is often substantial. The most common complaint that farmers had up in the thumb was broken tile to their fields. One farmer noted it may take 10 to 20 years to correct the drain damage done and assumes you will have to shoulder the burden. DTE is a reputable company on that front. They will pay to have the tiling fixed. The question is, can they get it fixed in the window of opportunity that works for the farmer? So what the University of Michigan researcher found is that a lot of times farmers would go ahead and fix it themselves because they needed it done then, versus waiting to submit a claim and then wait for them to come out and repair it, that they would actually do it themselves. Now, I thought about taking this one out, given that we just had a very young pilot killed over by where I live. But the National Agricultural Aviation Association says that as ag pilots have been injured and even killed in incidents involving wind turbines and met towers, the result is expensive litigation and landowner liability. The presence of wind turbines can restrict and in many cases eliminate the option of aerial application. They go on to say, this is not just an aerial application concern. Improper wind turbine siting may negatively affect emergency medical flights, aerial firefights, pipeline patrol planes, and other low-flying operations. It is not just an aviation concern. I tried to do some research on my own, and every life flight or similar outfit, if you will, had said it is at the pilot's discretion to decide if they will navigate within an industrial wind project. So for me as a rural person who doesn't have a lot of access to emergency care, that is very significant. So the amount of land that is actually rendered undevelopable is more than anticipated. The effects on crops are complex. One good thing can offset another. That field is still very much being discovered and changed because this is a new thing. The National Weather Service just did an article 2 or 3 weeks ago where the land under the turbines has been heated so much that it throws off the weather radar, that they show up as these little pockets that you see. So DTE's own material contradicts their fact because they say they restore the land. I'm not going to get into this too much, but basically in DTE's fact, they say that to create a new system and compare it to an existing system is what they do. So they're not doing an apples to apples comparison in their fact here about what it can do to electricity costs. When DTE back in 2012 was fighting the mandate that the state wanted to do, their materials projected that if you looked at new putting in a new wind development and a new comparable equivalent conventional, that wind energy is at least 67% more expensive than conventional because they factored in the cost of the production tax credit. The production tax credit will cost people in this country, taxpayers, almost $26 billion in a 4-year period. That is what a wind developer earns on all of the electricity that is generated through their project. One of the things that I do agree with on DTE is they say that energy companies follow township and county ordinances. Yes, they do. Which is why what's happening here in this township right now is so very important. All of the things that are said, unless they are in a lease, which has very few things specified, or are in zoning, are open to whatever the wind developer wants to do. Townships have broad powers to enact and enforce ordinances. Townships, large and small, provide services tailored to meet the needs of their residents, and it is the level of government most responsive to the wishes of the people that live there. So our township boards are responsible for protecting the health, welfare, and safety of all residents. Our township board is not responsible for any wind developer's bottom line or profit. Our township board has 100% of the say in where a wind park would be located and must do so to protect all residents equitably. The way to do that is through setbacks, like based on the science and the research that we were talking about, 1.25 miles from the base of the turbine to the property line, or 4 times the height, whichever is greater. Noise limits that do not more than double an ambient noise, and no humanly perceptible vibrations at property lines also, so that you do not have your sleep disrupted. In Madison Township, I forget what's going on here, sorry, no shadow flicker across into a non-participant's land and no shadow flicker on a public paved road. Turbine height is only dictated by what zoning allows. DTE presented Madison Township with a letter of intent about the size of their turbine, that they intended to be less than 500 feet tall. The only way to hold them accountable for that is through specifying it in zoning. A letter of intent is not a legally binding document. And we also asked for turbines that had the radar-controlled red lights on them so that the red lights would only blink, I believe it's a 5-mile, somebody, if anybody knows, jump out here, a 5-mile radius. Once that aircraft is detected, then the red lights blink so that you don't have that interrupting your life. The University of Michigan's Center for Sustainable Systems put out an energy fact sheet in August of last year. And they said, Class 3 winds are the minimum needed for a commercially viable project. This is their map picture. This is not my map picture. And if you look really close, you will see that the best wind in Michigan is in the thumb and along the lake, and we have a couple tiny little dots there. We have the minimum required for a commercially viable project. So the question to ask the wind developer is it only commercially viable because of tax subsidies and production tax credits, or would you do it without those? Here is a map. There's a really neat tool online that just came out recently where you can go in and any place in the country and see how many turbines there are. And I know it's not really showing it very well, but here's the outline of Michigan, and here's our wind turbines. So you can see our wind here in Branch County, whether or not it has supported any wind development to date. Capacity factors are something that are put out there to say how much energy can be generated by a project. And when you look at things that are put out by a wind developer as to how much they want to do, you have to look at what is installed capacity. That tells you whether or not it's a capacity factor or whether that's the most that they can make. Because a wind developer can say, we're going to power X amount of homes. We're putting enough turbines in to power X amount of homes. But if our wind at best in Michigan for onshore is 33% and we're not even in the best wind, then you need to say, okay, but if that's what the machines can generate, what would they actually output based on our wind speeds? It's a little techie, but it's important to see, is this really even a viable place in this part of the state for wind? I already mentioned this fact, but in the 4-year period that will end in 2020, production tax credits are going to cost taxpayers $25.7 billion. So So when a utility company writes a check to lease a land, a great deal of that money is funded through subsidies. I personally would like them to take that $25 billion over a 4-year period and divvy it up among homeowners and give us all 6 solar panels and a 25-foot windmill and make us self-sustaining, but no one's lobbying for that. That's my opinion. That's not an official coalition position. I'm sorry, I know it's really warm in here. I'm going as quick as I can. Michigan consumers have already paid, as of 2013, that's the most recent data I could find, almost $700 million in surcharges to support the expansion of renewable energy in the state. DTE last year earned $1.1 billion. Out of the last 10 years, they had 3 years where they paid 0 federal taxes, and in the other 7 they paid minimal taxes. And in a 10-year period, they spent almost $15 million in lobbying. I love a capitalist society. I truly do. I think we have the best system on the planet, but I as a consumer would like to have a choice as to whether or not I am buying this company's product. Because when developers answer to their shareholders, the reality is that townships in Michigan, because we are on such small grids, I'm concerned whether or not a township in this state has the resources to hold any wind developer accountable if they were to come into their community. DTE began signing leases in March of 2017, but many residents are still just finding this out. That's frustrating as a non-participant. It's so much so that in the state of Kentucky, who actually happens to have comparable wind to what we have in this part of Michigan, they passed a law that said if a wind developer leases land, they have 30 days, I think it is, 30 days to put a public notice in the paper and notify land adjacent to the leased land. And you know what happened? The wind developer said that that's against our business practice. We won't be able to successfully do our business model here if people find out about it within 30 days of leasing the land. I'm going to try to not have a lot of inflection in my voice on this particular topic, but this actually hits a very sore spot with me because I know a lot of wonderful people who have had their doors knocked on 10, 11, 12 times by DTE subcontractors in the field. We've had people in Madison Township told, you don't have good wind, the government makes us do these studies, we won't ever build here. It's just exploratory, so you might as well take the free money. We've had people told, you don't have good enough wind here, so we have to go up and put bigger turbines in 600 foot plus. And then we also have people that are told, these things are going to be built here, you're going to look at them anyway, you might as well take the government's money. When I brought this last particular instance to the DT executive, gentleman Matt Wagner, at the Chicago Street School that we did in Madison in May, I said, help me understand this. This is my problem that I'm struggling with. I just got a phone call today from the nephew of an elderly farmer who lives alone in Madison Township and has been visited over a dozen times. And this is what they tell him. I said, that's not true. That was inflection. If you can't sell the product by telling the consistent sales pitch, that should be a red flag to the township. So the reality is that zoning should not give your neighbor's tenants legal access to your land via improper setbacks. Setbacks have to be from property lines versus dwellings. Otherwise, you will certainly have a devaluation of your property. Neighbors have to look out for each other. Because of the consequences in this new industry of these turbines that are so big, we are in uncharted territory. Many times in our country, we've jumped in and then we backpedal and try to clean up the mess. This is an opportunity to get it right the first time. We had a farmer here in Branch County who did not lease his land, and this is what he told us. I do not want my children to be handcuffed to a lease that will far outlast my lifetime. What they choose to do with their inheritance, and ultimately the farm will be up to them. But leaving them with a lease that would dictate what they can and can't do with their land is just not an option for me. The lease that DTE is asking people to sign is a 40-year lease at DTE's discretion to extend by 20 years. A 60-year commitment.
Well, there were some other figures that just doesn't seem to make any sense. I can't believe they can't that it won't take at least 30% more concrete for footings. It's something that's 600 feet high instead of 4.
I think the contract clearly says that DTE is only required to remove facilities to 4 feet below grade.
At what turbine height were you basing that on?
Those studies, like the one that I talk a lot about was the 4-decade assessment of studies. And they've been looking at it for 4 decades. So if you figure that in the last 20 years, turbine height has doubled, then for half of that data, that would be a turbine of less than 300 feet total height.
Who would be liable?
I would have to double check the specifics in the time frame. I believe it was a California situation where the family and the wind developers were both held liable. But it had a recommendation that if you choose to put a turbine on your land, then you need to check with your insurance agent because there is could possibly be some new liability as per found out by the litigation of that particular suit. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Does DTE sell the leases out or, to other companies?
In their lease agreement, they have the sole discretion to at any time sell the lease to someone else.
I am a farmer, very small farmer, but I grow native grasses. And I do know that native grasses, their root systems go down 10 feet. So if you purchase land from anybody that has had turbines up that have been disassembled and no track idea of where they were, and that farm I want to purchase, how can it be that we are not going to be informed as people that are interested in purchasing land that existed? Wouldn't it be right that if our ordinance committee is developing some type of a ordinance about this, that it become part of the land definition or description?
If I'm understanding what your concern is correctly, the way that you control decommissioning is through your zoning. So if a zoning ordinance does not specifically address decommissioning, then there would be some potential issues for people if land changed hands. The only way to ensure the restoration of the land is through zoning. Because DTE, the way that they ask people to do it in their contract is to just remove the top 4. I don't know much else about that one.
Well, but if they, the landowner shouldn't be held responsible for taking out all of that cement. But somehow, I think we should have record in our townships, through our zoning, that this exists. Because I don't know how we're all gonna know that it exists.
I think somebody knows something
It's
about
called a
that.
title search, right, Tom?
I had that done.
You would've, if you did a title search, before you purchased your property, you'd have knew that consumers had an easement.
No, we had the title search and it wasn't done, it wasn't on there.
Then you
have a
should,
lawsuit against the
then you
title.
should go back to where you had the title search done and their response to pay the general.
I do title work for a living. Michigan is not required to record any document on any property. It's up to the discretion of the grantor and the grantee, or the lessor or the lessee, whether or not they want to put that information on public record.
So there I go. Yeah, it should be in our zoning. It should be zoned, if it does become that it's part of our communities, our townships. Our zoning should mandate that it becomes part of the township knowledge, because we aren't going to know where it is.
I think, and Shelley, I totally appreciate your passion on that. That's probably something that we would want to address with the planning commission then, to put in the zoning, because I don't really have any more of an answer on that one.
Thank you, I know.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
Yes.
Do you know of any farmer who has signed a lease and then changed his mind and wanted to get out of it? Is that a possibility? Can a farmer change his mind and get out of a lease?
I'm going to answer this with the disclosure that I'm not an attorney, obviously. Because this is a new industry, the way that you find out about things is through rulings and litigation, by going through public records and pulling up and doing searches with developers' names in them. I do not know of any, that was a lot closer. It's really warm up here. I've been talking for a long time. I'm just drinking water, I promise. I don't know of anyone in Michigan that has attempted, I have searched databases, don't know of any successful or even attempt to litigate out of that. I believe it was in Maine, and I'd have to double check again, where a husband and wife were able to get out of their lease, but the only reason they were able to get out is because they had not cashed a check. The other litigation that is available out there that I have seen or found myself, if someone had cashed a check and had been receiving payments, the contract was not, they were not permissible to get out of it. DTE in their contract, and I can get a copy of this to anyone who is interested, it is at their sole discretion. So let's say that a township makes it so that DTE does not want to put an industrial park here, then as of the date that that ordinance is submitted and approved, then that is probably a safe bet that that is the date that DTE would cancel that contract, unless they felt there was another venue to go through or around, but that is my understanding.
As far as getting out of a contract, there are ways to get out of a contract. If you signed a contract without understanding the contract, if you didn't seek legal counsel, an attorney's take on the contract, if there's any misrepresentations in the contract, if there's anything you didn't understand and you didn't have legal representation, you can appeal and get out of a contract. If there's any misspellings, if there's any inaccuracies, etc., you can get out of a contract. So that doesn't necessarily have to be binding if somebody signs a contract and didn't meet certain criteria. As far as wind farms go, I used to be pro wind energy. I had no conception that it would be used by huge industrial power corporations to gain control over the resources of people like the people in my own community. When I saw a documentary about 4 years ago called Big Wind, I changed my gears and stopped promoting big wind, seeing what they were doing with it. In fact, one of my neighbors didn't sign a contract with DTE because he wanted his own wind systems, and they said, no, you can't have them. You sign this, and you can't have your own wind. You can't block our wind. This is ours. They get the, not only in that contract, the wind, the rights to the wind, but the land surrounding and underneath those turbines. So it's a way that these corporations are taking control of our community's resources. And I think it's wrong. I think people are getting cheated. And if we don't have adequate setbacks, and I think 3 miles is a good setback to start off with. Out west, they've got them like 15 miles away from homes. And you can still see them. You can't hear them, but you can still see them. We need setbacks from people's homes and property to protect our residents and our quality of life.
Well, I have a question for Mrs. Smith. At the last meeting, you said that wind turbines amounted to 0.5% of the gross monies for the farms, on an average, 0.5%. Is that what you said? Okay. My question is, why? I mean, I was in business for 40 years. 0.5%. Why would any of the farmers want to shove this down our throats for 0.5%? I mean, me personally, in my business, I wouldn't do that to anybody for 0.5%.
Is that your public comment?
Yes.
Because I'm not answering questions tonight.
I just wanted to know if that was the right amount that you said.
That is what I said.
Okay.
Do you have a public comment that is relevant?
Yes, that was my comment.
As a farmer, if a wind turbine is put on any of the land that I farm, it would actually be an inconvenience to me because I'd have to farm around it and I'd lose some land. That said, and this is probably not going to be a popular opinion for this crowd, I am strongly supporting this development because 3 things. One, despite what Ms. Reed said in the presentation, I think it's unquestionable that there will be a financial gain. If you take an undeveloped piece of property and put a $2 million turbine on it, there is going to be added value there. There's going to be taxation. Whether that taxation all stays in Sherwood or Union City or goes to the county or goes to the state, I'm a resident of the state, and any money that's coming in is a net plus. But that's not the primary reason that I am in support. The second reason is that I think we're talking about property rights. I think it's a very slippery slope when you start saying, I want to cut down somebody else's property rights just because I don't like the way something looks. And I think that's what the picture of Union Lake with the superimposed windmills, I think that's what it was attempting to do. But the primary reason that I'm in support is, as an environmentalist, and I consider myself an avid environmentalist, we have, as energy consumers, contributed to global warming. I don't think there's any question about that, although a gentleman who was in the opposition came up to, when I talked to him at a meeting in Union City the other day, said, well, I don't believe in global warming, I guess. Well, that's the end of that discussion. But I think we have an obligation as human beings, as members of the human race, and members of this planet to try to save it. And this is one way that we can do it. We can't keep burning fossil fuels. Sure, we could go to solar, that's great, but that's only 35% of the time. So I think it has to be a combination of renewables. It has to be solar, it has to be wind, it has to be hydro is fine too, although you're not going to get many new hydro projects because there's downsides to that, silt buildup and blocking natural runoff and stuff like that. So I think we have to look at this in the bigger picture and not be quite so selfish as to our own, what we want and how we've always lived and what we see, and we don't want that view to change, especially when it's on somebody else's property. I think that we owe it to the environment and to the people that come after us to try to do something. And my view is if we get windmills here, we're going to be able to see that we've done something to help save the planet. Thank you.
Thank you. We're all friends and neighbors. I'm driving around my lawnmower the other day, do a lot of thinking. Seems to be when I do a lot of thinking. But it just came to me. We are all friends and neighbors. I have been attending this Sherwood Free Methodist Church for 30 years. I've lived here for 30 years. These are people, this is my home, this is my home. We've developed a us and them mentality with this, people for, people against. I just want to make sure and to plant a seed in the board. If you guys are decision, if you guys are seeing it as us and them, you're wrong. This is all of us. This is we. This is all of us together here. So your decision. I respect you guys because you didn't ask for this. I appreciate the research that have been that you guys have had. And again, it is my intention to not live in an industrial wind park. That is my position. If it does go through, I will be seeking to be.
That I'm the second person in the country to be able to prove that I have environmental illness or multiple chemical sensitivities. This issue is kind of new to me because I'm not in this area and I'm so involved with so many others, but I did want to speak up in general. DTE is not your friend. They're a corporation. They want to make money. That's their most important thing that they do. Most corporations, they don't really care about people. They care about what they're doing. DTE in Detroit and Highland Park decided to converge with Consumers Energy as partners to get their money back from the poor that weren't affording it. But what they did was they made it more costly and the people couldn't pay the bill. So besides the water that's been cut off so much in Detroit, a lot of people have lost those things too. So that shows me that people don't care.
And like Mr. West said, we've all been friends and neighbors, some of us for generations, and I really believe that that's the most important piece here. DTE says they're a good corporate neighbor. There's no such thing. It's not going to happen. Mr. Bronson, I really appreciate what you said. From the environmental standpoint, I believe that site pollution is a thing, and I believe that it's going to be that pollution of my skyline is going to be a thing. I came back through Illinois and traveled through a wind farm, and their turbines were only 240 feet high, and at any point that I stopped and stood, I could see 20 of them. And it made me physically ill to know that we were going to say goodbye to our pristine rural environment. If we wanted to live in town, I'm sure we'd all be living in town because everybody knows that town life is easier. Mr. Bronson, you've got the best sweet corn around. I'm still going to come and buy it no matter what happens. I've known some of you guys since I was a little bitty girl, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to leave, but my quality of life is going to be diminished when this happens. And based on Pam's presentation, I'd like to remind my planning commission members that that draft that you guys are looking at right now and can be amended, that quarter-mile setback just isn't enough. And I really encourage you to take a look at that mile and a quarter that Madison Township is considering right now. Thank you.
I'm a real estate broker, and my big concern would be property values, specifically residentially. You know, everybody here, when they're looking at how this might affect their house, is going to go online and get a lot of different opinions. But somebody that might be considering buying a home near one of these is going to do that exact same thing. And pretty much anybody that isn't a farmer here that might be affected is somewhat scared. Is this going to be loud? Is this going to cause shadow flicker? Is it going to do a lot of different things? And that's the same thing that anybody that isn't around them is going to do if they're considering moving into our area. So that's a big concern for me. I've had a lot of people ask me about it. I've had potential buyers ask me about whether these are going to be around. So I'm definitely, it's something that we should consider.
Thank you.
Beauty. We do have a beautiful state here, very green, and I enjoy being outside, sitting on my back porch or in the front porch and looking out. I don't want to be looking out and see a 600-foot wind turbine in my backyard.
I would like to say that to Mr. Bronson's comment about us needing to do something about our environment, I think that all of us have responsibility, not just people that lease their land. I drove as a private consultant for 30 years and drove a 45-mile-an-hour vehicle so that I didn't have to use a lot of gas. I plant trees so I produce carbon dioxide, or take the carbon dioxide out and produce oxygen. There are many ways we can do it, and I think we all do it, but we aren't going to do it with big gas guzzling trucks. And so that's what I have to say. It's not going to be the air turbines that are going to really affect our environment at 5% of the electric production.
Thank you. I have one other one here.
Well, last weekend, the young man from DTE was here, and after the meeting, I did have an opportunity to speak with him. And I just asked him a couple questions. And my first question to him is, tell me how many of the executives at DTE, who I'm sure live in lovely neighborhoods, would want wind farms in their backyard visible to them. His response to me was, more than likely, none of them. That was the first thing. The other thing I asked him was about cumulative sound. I mean, when we talk about the decibels, how many wind turbines produce that decibel level that we would consider safe? And if you have one, and you have multiple ones around it, and they're all spinning and generating their energy, he says it's just like ripples in a lake. It's a cumulative sound, so the more you have, the more decibels it will produce. That's all, that's the only thing I wanted to say.
Had put their home up for sale, it was probably January, February. Recently, that home was just sold. I've heard because of the turbines, they reduced their price on their home by $75,000 so they could unload it before the turbines came in. Now, they had been reducing it a little bit, but the people that bought it saved $75,000. And it was because the people were nervous about the turbines.
One last one back here.
Hi, I'm Paula Fine, and I just wanted to comment more than anything else. I've heard the pros and the cons and about a lot of this. And a lot of things in our environment happen, and a lot of the motivation is money, I'm afraid. It's not good for the environment. And this is a relatively new endeavor. Technology is constantly changing, and I just believe that whatever we do, it would be nice to do it right the first time.
Thank you.
I think that the zoning board that we have here has got to make a decision to do something about all this. They have lots of outs. It's all new. It's new to everybody. Yes, I've leased my farm. No reason why not. Nobody said that they're going to put up a wind turbine on my farm. Nobody's, DTE hasn't said that they're going to put a turbine up here anywhere yet. They're talking 5 years down the road if they're going to do anything. It's just got to be a lot of things come out that are right information. That's it.
Okay.